The first thing James Hartwell did after buying his 320 acres of high prairie was dig a hole. Not a well, not a root cellar, not a foundation for the cabin that any sensible man would have built first. He dug a hole big enough to stable 6 horses 30 feet long and 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep, carved into the side of the only hill on his property. The neighbors who rode past during those first weeks of April 1883 couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. A grown man, 43 years old, former cavalry sergeant, with 15 years of service across the Western Territories, spending 12 hours a day with a pickaxe and shovel creating what looked like either a mass grave or the foundation of his own madness. William Tate heard about it first. He owned 11,500 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land and considered himself not just successful, but correct about nearly everything that mattered in ranching. When Samuel Pritchard mentioned the new neighbor's excavation project during a fence line discussion, Tate rode over immediately to see for himself. He found Hartwell waist-deep in red clay and gravel throwing dirt onto a growing pile with the mechanical determination of a man who had decided something and would not be argued out of it. "What are you building?" Hartwell didn't stop digging. "Stable." Tate looked at the dimensions of the hole, then at the hill behind it, then back at Hartwell. "Underground, that's right." Tate waited for elaboration that didn't come. He was used to men explaining themselves, especially to someone of his status and landholding. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, which Tate broke with the question everyone would eventually ask: why wind? That was all. One word delivered without drama or defensiveness, as if it explained everything. Tate felt something between amusement and concern. A man who answered questions with single words was either very wise or very disturbed, and nothing about digging a cave for horses suggested wisdom. Wind doesn't kill horses. Cold kills horses. Build a proper barn with walls and a roof if you're worried about winter. Hartwell finally stopped digging, leaning on his shovel. His face carried the deep tan of someone who had spent decades outdoors, lines carved around his eyes from squinting at horizons. Cold doesn't kill by itself. Wind turns cold into something that kills. Take the wind away, and horses can handle cold just fine. Tate had lost horses to winter. Every rancher had. It was part of the cost of doing business in Wyoming, where temperatures could drop to 30 below and stay there for a week. But building underground struck him as the response of someone who didn't understand the real problems. Horses needed air, needed light, needed to see the sky. Bury them in the ground and they'd sicken from damp and darkness before winter even arrived. You'll suffocate them down there, or they'll panic. Horses aren't meant to live in caves. They're not meant to freeze to death either, but they do that regular enough. Tate rode away already composing the story he'd tell at the next Stockmen's Association meeting. By the time he reached his own ranch, he'd decided on the phrasing. Hartwell's lost his mind. The name would stick, both the man's name attached to the hole and the judgment of his mental state. Within a week, every rancher from Laramie to Casper knew about the fool who was building a cave for horses. Within a month, Hartwell's hole had become shorthand for any idea too stupid to deserve serious consideration. James Hartwell heard the jokes and kept digging. He'd spent enough years in the cavalry to know how quickly men formed opinions and how slowly they changed them. What he'd learned in those years was more valuable than their approval. Observation mattered more than tradition, and what worked mattered more than what looked proper. He had observed something during his time in uniform that the gentleman ranchers had never seen, and that observation had burned itself into his memory with the permanence of trauma, the winter of 1878. The dull knife outbreak, they called it, though calling it an outbreak made it sound like disease instead of desperation. The Northern Cheyenne had been forced onto a reservation in Indian Territory land that was disease-ridden and food scarce, and nothing like the Montana homeland they had been promised. When they fled north in September, trying to reach their traditional territory before winter, the Army had been ordered to stop them. Hartwell's unit had been part of the pursuit. They'd ridden through autumn that turned to early winter temperatures dropping while they chased families who were running not towards something but away from slow death by starvation and sickness. The cavalry horses were well fed, regularly rotated, supported by a supply chain that kept them strong. The Cheyenne horses were half-starved, carrying families who had nothing but what could be loaded on their backs. By every measure of military logic, the cavalry mounts should have outlasted the Indian ponies by days, if not weeks. Then came October 23rd. The blizzard arrived without warning, temperature plummeting 40 degrees in 3 hours. Hartwell remembered the sky turning the color of old pewter, remembered how the wind started as a whisper and built to a scream within minutes. They'd made camp in open prairie, the standard cavalry approach: circle the wagons, picket the horses, on the perimeter, trust in superior equipment and training to weather whatever nature delivered. He woke the next morning to find 14 horses dead. Not sick, not injured, dead. Frozen solid where they'd stood, killed by a combination of wind and cold that had turned survivable conditions into execution. The Cheyenne camp, visible a mile away across the snow-covered grass, had lost 2 horses. 2 when they'd started with animals that were already weakened by months of hard travel and inadequate feed. Hartwell had walked to the Cheyenne position that afternoon during a temporary ceasefire negotiated to bury the dead. He'd expected to find some secret, some technique or equipment that explained the disparity. What he found was simpler and more profound. They had dug into a hillside. Not deep, just enough to get the horses below the wind line into a natural depression that blocked the cutting edge of the storm. While cavalry horses had stood exposed to wind that hit them at full force, Cheyenne ponies had weathered the same storm in relative calm. The Cheyenne families had moved on by evening, still running north. Hartwell's unit had spent 3 days replacing their dead horses before continuing the pursuit. He'd requested a meeting with his commanding officer that night, suggesting they adopt the Cheyenne technique of seeking or creating windbreaks for their animals. The officer had told him that the United States cavalry did not take tactical advice from Indians who were currently in violation of federal law. The conversation had ended there, but the lesson hadn't. Hartwell resigned his commission 6 months later. The image of frozen horses burned into his memory, alongside the knowledge that they died because pride had prevented anyone from recognizing a better way. He'd saved every dollar of his military pay for 5 years, living on bare minimum, sending nothing home, because he had no home to send to. His wife had died of pneumonia 3 winters back, childless, leaving him with nothing to stay for. When he finally had enough money to buy land, he chose Wyoming specifically because it was hard country that would test what he'd learned. The excavation took from April through October. Working alone because hiring help would have required explaining his purpose to men who would have refused the work on principle or taken his money while laughing behind his back. Hartwell dug with pick and shovel, hauling dirt out of the growing hole in a wheelbarrow, building up the entrance ramp, with each load removed from the interior. The work was brutal in a way that made his cavalry service seem easy by comparison. In the army, at least, he'd had purpose that others understood and respected. Here, he had only his own certainty and the memory of dead horses to sustain him through 12-hour days of physical labor. The hill he'd chosen was perfect for his purpose. A natural rise in otherwise flat prairie, its south-facing slope offered protection from the north winds that made Wyoming winters lethal. The soil was a mix of clay and gravel that held its shape when excavated, requiring minimal shoring during construction. Water drained naturally toward the lower prairie, eliminating the flooding that would have made underground construction impossible. He'd studied the site for 3 weeks before buying the land, checking how snow drifted, where water pooled after spring rains, how the wind moved across the terrain in different seasons. The cavalry had taught him to read ground, to understand how landscape shapes survival. His neighbors watched the progress with amusement that gradually shifted toward concern. Samuel Pritchard, whose ranch bordered Hartwell's property to the west, stopped by in late May, ostensibly to discuss water rights, but actually to assess whether this new neighbor posed a threat to the community's reputation. "You planning to live down there? Because I've got to tell you, that's not how civilized people live. We left caves behind a long time ago." Hartwell leaned on his shovel, sweat dripping. Despite the spring chill, "It's for the horses. Wind can't reach them down there." Pritchard looked at the excavation, then at Hartwell, then back at the excavation. "You're digging a cave because of wind. Horses handle wind fine. They've got hair. That's what hair is for. Hair doesn't stop wind at 40 below. Nothing stops wind at 40 below except not being in it. Then build a proper barn. Walls, roof, door. That's how barns work. That's how barns have always worked. You don't need to dig a hole in the ground like some kind of badger." Hartwell returned to his digging. "Barns have gaps. Wind finds gaps. Underground has no gaps. Underground is just earth, and earth doesn't have gaps." Pritchard rode away, shaking his head, already composing his own version of the story. Another voice to join Tate's in the chorus of mockery that would define Hartwell's first year in Wyoming. By June, Hartwell's hole wasn't just a joke among the wealthy ranchers. It was something working men discussed in saloons, something their wives mentioned over church socials, something children used as shorthand for foolishness. Nobody dug holes for horses. Nobody had ever dug holes for horses. The fact that nobody had done it proved it was wrong. The stonework began in July after the hole had reached its final dimensions. Hartwell had collected rocks from across his property throughout late spring, hauling them by wagon to pile beside the excavation. Now he began laying them up as walls, creating a lining that would prevent the earth sides from crumbling and would provide thermal mass to moderate the underground temperature. The technique wasn't original. He'd seen it used by settlers in Minnesota, by farmers in Nebraska, by anyone who understood that earth-sheltered construction offered advantages that above-ground buildings couldn't match. But applying it to a horse stable was unusual enough to draw continued attention from neighbors who couldn't resist monitoring his progress. Thomas Brennan was the first to visit with something approaching genuine curiosity instead of judgment. He was 39 younger than Hartwell by 4 years, and he'd lost 8 horses the previous winter to a combination of cold and wind that had caught him unprepared. His barn had been adequate for ordinary winters, but catastrophically insufficient when temperatures dropped to 25 below and stayed there for 11 days. The horses that survived had been weakened enough that 2 more died of respiratory infection before spring. Walls look good, I'll give you that much. But how do you expect to get horses down into a hole? They're not going to climb a ladder. Hartwell pointed to the entrance ramp. He'd been constructing a gradual slope that descended from ground level to the stable floor. Walk them down, same as walking them into any barn. Grade's gentle enough for a loaded wagon. Horse won't even notice the descent. Brennan walked the ramp, testing its grade with his own feet. The angle was less steep than some trails he'd ridden, certainly manageable for a horse that wasn't panicked or injured. It's solid. Still think you're crazy, but it's solid crazy. What about air? Horses need air. Underground means no air. Hartwell led him to a wooden frame he'd constructed at the hill's peak 15 feet from the stable entrance. Ventilation shaft. Warm air rises, exits through the shaft, pulls fresh air in through the entrance. Same principle as a chimney. As long as there's temperature difference between inside and outside, air moves. The technical explanation impressed Brennan despite his skepticism. The man had clearly thought this through, had considered problems that most builders wouldn't anticipate until they became disasters. Maybe the underground stable was foolish, but it wasn't stupid, and there was a difference that Brennan was beginning to appreciate. Stupid meant not thinking. Foolish might mean thinking differently, which could be either genius or disaster, depending on whether it worked. I hope it works. God knows we lose enough horses to winter as it is. If your hole saves even one animal, it'll be worth all the jokes. It'll save more than one. Wait and see. Brennan became the first regular visitor, stopping by every week or so to check progress, and Hartwell suspected to satisfy his own curiosity about whether underground construction could actually work. Other ranchers visited too, but their motives were less ambiguous. They came to confirm their initial judgment, to gather details that would make better stories at the Stockmen's Association meetings. Hartwell recognized the difference between Brennan's questions, which sought understanding, and theirs, which sought ammunition for mockery. The ceiling beams went in during late September. Massive timbers that Hartwell had purchased from a sawmill in Laramie and hauled 70 miles across the prairie. Each beam was 12 inches thick and 20 feet long, strong enough to support the earth and sod that would cover the stable's roof. Installing them alone was the most dangerous work Hartwell had attempted. Each beam weighed over 300 pounds, requiring a system of ropes and pulleys and levers that multiplied his strength, but also multiplied the consequences of any mistake. He worked carefully, methodically, accepting the slow pace that safety required. Each beam took a full day to position and secure, the process repeated 8 times until the ceiling was complete. The wooden frame created a grid that would distribute the weight of the earth above evenly across the stone walls below. Hartwell had calculated the load-bearing capacity using principles learned from an engineer he'd met during his cavalry service, a man who'd designed bridge foundations and taught Hartwell that math didn't care about tradition, only about whether the numbers worked. William Tate visited during the 6th beam installation, unable to resist seeing the famous hole for himself. He arrived on a fine bay horse with silver-mounted tack, dressed in tailored clothes that marked him as a successful businessman rather than a working rancher. The contrast with Hartwell shirtless and covered in sweat and grime could not have been more stark. It's bigger than I expected. Stupid, but big. You could stable a dozen horses down there. 6 comfortably. 8 in an emergency. More than that, and they don't have room to move. And horses that can't move get sick. Tate watched as Hartwell struggled with the beam using his pulley system to lift one end while he positioned support posts underneath. Horses that live in caves probably get sick anyway. Dampness, darkness, bad air. A horse needs sky, needs to see the horizon. You're going to drive them mad keeping them underground. Hartwell paused his work long enough to look directly at Tate. Horses don't care about horizons. They care about wind and cold and dying. Underground has none of those things. The certainty in his voice was what Tate would remember later, that absolute conviction that suggested either deep wisdom or profound delusion. In that moment, watching a middle-aged former sergeant wrestle with timber that could kill him if it fell, Tate couldn't tell which. He rode away without another word, his report at the next stockman's meeting emphasizing not just the foolishness of the project but its scale. Not just a hole, gentlemen, but an enormous hole. An engineering project that must have consumed every dollar the man possessed. I'll wager $500 his horses don't survive the winter. When they die, I'll buy his land for $200 and fill that ridiculous hole. He'll be bankrupt by spring. If the winter doesn't kill his horses, the debt will. Then we'll buy his land for pennies and bury that ridiculous mistake. The assembled ranchers had laughed and raised their glasses. It was always pleasant to anticipate another man's failure, especially a man who thought he knew better than everyone else. Tate's prediction was met with general agreement, though Thomas Brennan had stayed silent, thinking about the careful calculations he'd seen scratched into Hartwell's stable walls, the methodical approach to problems most men wouldn't anticipate. The 6th beam nearly ended everything. Hartwell had it raised to 3/4 height when the support post on the eastern side slipped. The beam swung sideways, still attached to the pulley rope, but no longer controlled 300 pounds of lumber, pivoting through the air like a pendulum designed to crush whatever it hit. Hartwell threw himself backward, the beam missing his skull by inches, slamming into the stone wall hard enough to crack 2 stones and send fragments flying. He lay on his back in the dirt, hard hammering, watching the beam sway above him. 10 seconds either way, and it would have killed him either by direct impact or by pinning him against the wall. Nobody would have found him for days. Nobody even knew to check. He spent that night in his half-finished cabin, hands shaking as he drank coffee, replaying the moment when death had passed close enough to feel its wind. In the cavalry, there had always been witnesses, people who would report his death, meaning that would attach to his sacrifice. Here, dying would prove only that he'd been foolish, that the neighbors had been right to mock him. The hole would fill with time and weather, becoming a depression in the hillside that future ranchers would ride past without knowing what it had almost been. But he didn't die. The beam had missed, the support post hadn't broken, the pulley rope had held. He went back the next morning and installed the remaining 2 beams with additional safety measures, taking 3 days instead of 2, accepting that pride had nearly killed him and adjusting his methods accordingly. Thomas Brennan stopped by during the final beam installation, noticed the cracked stones and fresh caution in Hartwell's movements. Something happened. Beam slipped. Nearly took my head off. Brennan looked at the crack pattern, reading the violence of the impact. You should have asked for help. Plenty of men would have helped with this part, even if they think the whole project is crazy. They'd have helped and then told everyone I couldn't do it alone. I needed to prove I could. Prove to who? Everyone already thinks you're crazy. Dying won't change their minds, just give them a different kind of story to tell. The words stung because they were true. Hartwell had been operating on cavalry logic where competence and self-sufficiency earned respect. But civilian life had different rules. Asking for help wasn't weakness. Here, it was community. His isolation was his own choice, and it had nearly killed him. Next time I'll ask, Brennan nodded, satisfied. Good, because I want to see if this works. Be a shame if you died before we found out. The roof went on through October, layer upon layer of timber and brush and sod that transformed the excavation from a hole in the ground to a feature that barely showed above the prairie. When Hartwell finished, only the entrance ramp and the ventilation shaft indicated that anything unusual existed on this patch of rangeland. From a distance, the hill looked natural, just another rise in the endless grassland that stretched to every horizon. He led his horses down the ramp on November 1st. 6 animals that represented his entire investment in the ranching life, purchased with the last of his savings after buying the land and constructions materials. They were good horses, not fancy breeding stock, but solid working animals that had already survived one Wyoming winter in the inadequate lean-to that had served as temporary shelter. Hartwell had bought them specifically because they were proven, because they demonstrated the will to survive that separated good horses from merely adequate ones. The horses hesitated at the ramp's entrance, suspicious of the descent into darkness. Hartwell led them one at a time, speaking softly, letting each animal adjust to the strange new environment. The mare he called Dusty was most nervous, her ears swiveling at every echo off the stone walls, her nostrils flared as she tested the underground air. Hartwell sat with her for 4 hours that first day, brushing her coat and speaking softly until she relaxed enough to eat without watching the shadows. The gelding named Sergeant, named for Hartwell's own former rank, adapted fastest. Within 3 days, he was leading the other horses down the ramp without hesitation, as if he'd spent his entire life walking into hillsides. Horses were smarter than people gave them credit for. They knew what kept them safe. They didn't care if it looked strange. They just knew. The bond between Hartwell and his animals became visible to anyone who visited the underground stable. The horses nickered when they heard his footsteps on the ramp. They pressed their noses against his chest when he entered their space. They trusted him in a way that went beyond simple feeding and care. They trusted him because he had proven himself trustworthy, because he had built them a place that felt safe in ways they couldn't articulate but understood completely. The first snow fell on November 15th, a light dusting that melted by noon. The second snow came a week later, heavier but still manageable. The horses spent their days in the underground stable and their nights in the pasture, adjusting to a routine that kept them sheltered when weather threatened and free when conditions permitted. Hartwell monitored this carefully, watching how they responded to different temperatures and wind conditions, learning the threshold where they sought shelter voluntarily versus when he needed to bring them in regardless of their preference. December brought harder cold temperatures, dropping below zero for the first time that season. Hartwell monitored his underground stable, carefully measuring temperature with a thermometer he'd purchased in Cheyenne specifically for this purpose. The results confirmed what he'd hoped. While outside temperatures plunged to 15 below zero, the stable maintained a steady 38 degrees, cool but not cold, comfortable for horses that would have suffered badly in any above-ground structure, where wind could penetrate gaps and sweep away body heat. Thomas Brennan stopped by on December 20th to check on his neighbor and found himself genuinely curious about the underground operation. How do you keep it so warm? No stove that I can see. No heating at all. Earth is warm, 50 degrees year-round at this depth. The horses add their own heat. 6 horses produce as much warmth as a decent stove. Between the earth and the animals, the stable heats itself. And in summer, same principle in reverse, exactly. Earth stays cool while air gets hot. The stable will be 50-some degrees in July, while above-ground barns turn into ovens. Horses will be more comfortable in August than they are now. Brennan considered this, calculating implications he hadn't previously considered. You've really thought this through. I owe you an apology. I laughed, with the others called this Hartwell's hole, like everyone else. But you might be onto something, might be. We'll know for certain when the real cold comes. The real cold hadn't come yet, though December temperatures were harsh enough to kill 3 horses across the territory. Samuel Pritchard lost 2 to what he called bad luck, but was actually inadequate shelter. A rancher named David Morrison lost one when his barn door froze shut and the horse panicked, trying to escape. These deaths were normal, expected, the cost of doing business in Wyoming winter. Every rancher factored horse mortality into their annual budgets, setting aside money to replace the animals that wouldn't survive to spring. Hartwell heard about these deaths and said nothing. He wouldn't gloat, wouldn't point out that his horses remained healthy while others died. The proof would come, or it wouldn't, and talking about it beforehand would only make the failure more humiliating if the underground stable turned out to be the tomb his critics predicted. Better to wait to let winter itself deliver the verdict that would silence all argument one way or another. Christmas passed quietly. Hartwell spent it alone with his horses, preferring their company to the forced cheerfulness of community gatherings, where his presence would remind everyone of their mockery. He sat in the underground stable on Christmas evening, listening to the wind howl across the prairie above, while the horses stood calm in their earth-wrapped sanctuary. The contrast between the violence outside and the peace within was everything he'd hoped to create, everything the cavalry should have learned when their horses froze while Cheyenne ponies survived. The barometric pressure began dropping on January 6. Old Daniel Moss, a hunter who'd lived in Wyoming for 40 years, stopped by Hartwell's property that morning with a warning. This feels like the winter of '72, ravens flying low, horses restless. Sky's got that look. Get everything ready because when it comes, it'll come hard. Hartwell spent January 7th preparing. He brought all 6 horses underground, permanently stocking the stable with enough hay to last a month without accessing outside supplies. He filled water barrels from the creek before it could freeze solid. He checked the ventilation shaft to ensure it was clear, reinforced the entrance ramp against potential drifting, and moved his own supplies to the cabin closest to the stable entrance. If the storm was as bad as Moss predicted, he might need to stay underground with the horses rather than risk the 50-yard trek to his cabin. William Tate rode past that afternoon, noticed the preparations, and stopped to deliver what he clearly considered a courtesy warning. You're sealing yourself in. When that shaft clogs with snow and you run out of air, you'll suffocate down there with your horses. This is exactly what I warned about. Hartwell finished securing the hay bales before responding. The shaft won't clog. It's designed to stay clear even in heavy snow. And even if it did, the entrance ramp provides enough air exchange to keep everyone alive. Tate gestured toward his own barn, visible a mile away across the prairie. That's proper shelter. Walls, roof, ventilation on all 4 sides. 52 horses, all of them safe in the best barn money can buy. $22,000 of lumber from Oregon, designed by an architect who knows what he's doing. That's how civilized men protect their investments. Your barn is beautiful, but beauty doesn't stop wind. Tate's face flushed. When my horses survive and yours suffocate in that cave, you'll leave Wyoming in shame. I'll make certain everyone knows what happened, how your pride killed 6 animals that deserve better. He rode off before Hartwell could respond, his anger palpable. The confrontation troubled Hartwell less than it might have. Tate's certainty was too absolute, his investment in being right too complete. Men like that didn't learn from being told, only from experiencing consequences themselves. If the storm proved the underground stable worked, Tate would find some way to dismiss or minimize the success. Only disaster on his own scale would penetrate that armor of certainty. The temperature began dropping that evening. 40 degrees in 4 hours, the kind of plunge that warned of something catastrophic building in the north. Hartwell stood at his cabin door, watching the sky turn colors that had no names, feeling the wind shift from variable to directional to relentless. This was it, the test he'd been preparing for since April, the validation or condemnation of everything he had built. He went underground at sunset, choosing to stay with his horses rather than risk being separated when the storm hit full force. The stable was warm, the animals calm. Sargent stood near the entrance, head up, sensing something wrong in the world above, but not panicked by it. Dusty moved close to Hartwell, her nervousness from November completely gone, replaced by trust that this place was safe regardless of what happened outside. The wind hit at midnight with force that sounded like freight trains colliding. Hartwell heard it even underground, felt it through the earth itself, a vibration that spoke of violence occurring just beyond the protection he'd created. The horses stirred but didn't panic. They could hear the storm but couldn't feel it, and that distinction made all the difference between manageable fear and terror that could kill through pure stress. He spent that first night awake, monitoring ventilation and temperature and horse behavior, ready to respond if anything went wrong. Nothing did. The stable held. The shaft stayed clear. The temperature remained steady at 38 degrees, while outside, invisible but measurable, the real cold came to Wyoming with the fury of biblical judgment. Morning came without dawn. The sky remained the same gray-black it had been at midnight visibility, measured in feet rather than miles. Hartwell climbed the entrance ramp to check conditions and was driven back by wind that hit like a physical blow. The temperature gauge he'd mounted outside read -37. He'd seen cold before, had endured winters that killed unprepared men, but this felt different. The wind carried a malice that went beyond mere weather, howling across the prairie with sustained fury that suggested days rather than hours of punishment. He retreated underground and checked his horses. All 6 stood calm, eating hay, as if this were any ordinary January day. Sargent nuzzled his shoulder, looking for the apple slices Hartwell usually carried. The contrast between their peace and the violence occurring 30 feet above them was so stark it felt unreal, like existing in two separate worlds simultaneously. Thomas Brennan arrived at 3 that afternoon, appearing at the stable entrance so suddenly that Hartwell startled. Brennan was covered in snow, his face raw with frostbite, moving with the stiff gait of someone who'd pushed past exhaustion into survival mode. His barn had collapsed under snow load at noon, the entire structure folding inward with a sound like breaking bones. 5 of his 12 horses had died immediately, crushed under timber that was supposed to protect them. 7 had escaped, 3 of them injured badly enough that Brennan knew they wouldn't last the night in exposed conditions. "I need help." The words came out between chattering teeth. "Can't get them to my cabin. Too far. Too much wind. They'll die out there." Hartwell was already moving, grabbing rope and a lantern. "How many can walk? 4. Maybe 5. 3 are hurt bad." They went out together into wind that made conversation impossible. Brennan's horses were huddled against the collapsed barn, using the wreckage as inadequate windbreak. The 3 injured animals were lying down, steam rising from wounds where broken timber had torn flesh. Hartwell assessed them with cavalry efficiency. 2 might survive with immediate shelter and care. The 3rd was bleeding internally, its breathing already shallow. "That one won't make it. We take the others first." Brennan's face showed the calculation every rancher had to make, the arithmetic of loss where sentiment couldn't override reality. He nodded once sharp, and they began leading the mobile horses toward Hartwell's stable. The distance was less than a quarter mile but felt infinite. Wind tore at them with force that made forward progress a battle of inches. Snow stung and exposed skin hard enough to draw blood. The horses balked, terrified by conditions their instincts said were death, trusting the men only because the alternative was certain freezing. They got 4 horses underground before full darkness made further rescue impossible. Hartwell's stable now held 10 animals instead of 6, crowded, but not dangerously so. The newcomers were wild-eyed and shaking their fear, filling the space with frantic energy that threatened to spread. Sargent moved among them with surprising authority, his calmness somehow communicating that this underground place meant safety. Within an hour, Brennan's horses had settled enough to accept hay, their survival instinct overriding terror now that immediate danger had passed. The 3 horses left behind would die overnight. Both men knew it without speaking. Brennan sat against the stone wall, his hands shaking from cold and shock, and the come down after desperate physical exertion. "I built that barn 5 years ago. Good timber, professional construction, did everything right according to every carpenter I consulted, and it folded like paper. The storm was worse than Wright could handle. $22,000 of lumber. That's what Tate spent on his barn. If mine couldn't handle this, his won't either." Hartwell didn't respond immediately, calculating the implications. Tate had 52 horses in that barn. If it collapsed with similar casualty rates, the death toll would be catastrophic. Not just financially devastating, but personally a failure so complete it would shatter the man's entire identity. Tate had built his reputation on being right, on knowing better than everyone else. Losing 50 horses would prove not just that he'd been wrong about Hartwell, but that his own certainty had killed animals that depended on his judgment. "We can't help him, can't even reach him in this." Brennan closed his eyes. "I know, but I keep thinking about those horses. They didn't choose to be in that barn. They trusted him to keep them safe, like yours trusted you." The words were harsh but necessary. Brennan needed to hear that his barn's failure wasn't moral weakness, just structural inadequacy against unprecedented conditions. Every rancher made the best decisions they could with the knowledge they had. Sometimes the knowledge was wrong. Sometimes conditions exceeded any reasonable preparation. The guilt would eat him alive if he believed he'd failed through negligence rather than facing something that exceeded normal parameters. They spent that night underground together, unable to reach either cabin through wind that hadn't diminished. Hartwell had stored emergency supplies for exactly this contingency: blankets and dried food and water. The stable's steady temperature made the confinement bearable, even comfortable, compared to the hell occurring above ground. The horses dozed, standing there breathing, creating a rhythm that was almost meditative. Brennan slept in exhausted bursts, waking periodically with the jerky alertness of trauma, checking that the horses were real and alive, and not dreams conjured by guilt. Morning of day 2 brought no improvement. The thermometer still read -37. The wind had increased, if anything, sustained gusts that Hartwell estimated at 60 miles per hour. Snow had drifted against every obstacle on the prairie, creating sculptures that bore no relationship to the flat landscape underneath. The entrance ramp to the stable was completely buried, requiring 2 hours of careful digging to create a tunnel to the surface. Hartwell worked methodically, aware that collapsing the tunnel would trap them all underground with limited air. The snow was packed hard as ice compressed by wind into density that required saw and shovel both to penetrate. When he finally broke through to open air, the scene beyond was apocalyptic. The prairie had vanished under white that stretched unbroken to every horizon. Buildings were buried to their roofs. Fence posts had disappeared completely. The world had been erased and rewritten as blank page, everything familiar made alien by sheer accumulation of frozen precipitation. Hartwell stood in his tunnel opening for 30 seconds, confirming what he already knew, then retreated underground before the cold could penetrate clothing and reach flesh. "We're trapped until it breaks." Brennan accepted this without argument. He'd seen enough Wyoming winters to understand that some storms didn't end when you needed them to. They ended when they finished saying what they meant to say. You got food for 10 horses instead of 6 for a month. Water for 3 weeks. We'll outlast the storm even if it runs 10 days. 10 days. The words hung heavy with implication. 10 days underground while neighbors died above. 10 days of safety while the territory learned whether preparation or pride determined survival. 10 days that would end with either vindication or isolation, depending on who remained to judge the outcome. The second day passed in strange timelessness that came from living in constant artificial light with no natural cues for circadian rhythm. Hartwell and Brennan took turns sleeping, maintaining watch not because danger threatened, but because consciousness in shifts made the hours pass faster. They talked sparingly, both men conserving energy and words for a marathon rather than sprint. The horses adapted faster than humans to the underground existence, finding comfort in routine feeding and the absolute consistency of temperature and environment. Dusty began showing signs of distress late on the second day. Hartwell noticed her pawing the ground repeatedly, turning tight circles, behavior that suggested either colic or pregnancy complications. He'd known she might be pregnant, had seen her bred by a neighbor's stallion last spring, but had thought she'd deliver in March. The storm's stress was triggering early labor. Her body's response to trauma pushing toward delivery, regardless of whether timing was optimal. "She's foaling." Brennan moved to help, immediately, cavalry training surfacing through rancher practice. Early, 2 months early, foal might not survive. They cleared space in the corner, farthest from the other horses, creating makeshift birthing area with fresh straw Hartwell had stored for exactly this kind of emergency. Dusty circled twice more, then went down, her labor progressing with frightening speed. The foal emerged in less than an hour, impossibly small, its coat slick with birth fluids that steamed in the stable's moderate temperature. It wasn't breathing. Hartwell cleared the foal's airway with practiced efficiency, rubbing its chest and ribs to stimulate respiration. 30 seconds of nothing. A minute. Brennan was about to say something when the foal gasped, a wet, rattling sound that transitioned to normal breathing within seconds. It lived. Against odds that said premature births and crisis conditions resulted in dead offspring, this one lived. Dusty stood and began licking her foal instinct, overriding the exhaustion of labor. The foal tried to stand within 10 minutes, legs folding comically before it managed to balance. Within 30 minutes, it was nursing, wobbling, but functional, demonstrating the resilience that separated horses that survived from those that merely existed. Hartwell watched this minor miracle and thought about the symbolism that would be lost on no one. Life beginning underground while death ruled the surface. Hope born in darkness while light offered only killing cold. What are you going to name it? Hartwell hadn't considered names. The foal might still die despite its initial survival. Premature births carried complications that manifested over days and weeks. But Brennan needed something to call it, some marker of identity that separated this particular survival from abstract statistics. Hope, because that's what it is. The third day brought subtle change in wind character, the relentless howl shifting to variable gusts that suggested the storm's core was moving. The temperature remained brutally cold but had risen to -32. A 5-degree improvement that Hartwell recognized as significant. The blizzard was weakening, not dramatically but measurably. By nightfall of day 3, they might be able to dig out properly, might be able to assess what the storm had done to the territory beyond their underground sanctuary. Brennan climbed the tunnel that afternoon, enlarging it enough to see across the prairie. He returned ashen-faced, not speaking for several minutes. When he finally found words, they came slowly, each one carrying weight that suggested he was reporting atrocity rather than weather aftermath. Tate's barn is gone. Just foundation left. I can't see any horses moving. 52 horses, dead or scattered into conditions where scattered meant dead. Tate's entire breeding program, his reputation, his certainty that wealth and proper construction would protect against anything nature delivered. All of it buried under snow or frozen into positions that would memorialize his failure until spring thaw revealed the full scope of catastrophe. Pritchard's barn is still standing, but I see holes in the roof. Morrison's place looks intact from here. Can't tell about the others, too much snow and distance. How many ranches can you see? 7. Counting ours. Hartwell did the mathematics. 7 ranches visible, maybe 40 horses total. If everyone had average herds, his stable held 10 horses all alive. That meant 30 other animals distributed across 6 ranches in conditions that had killed 52 in the territory's best barn. The survival rate was going to be catastrophically low. This wasn't going to be a normal winter with normal losses that ranchers absorbed and forgot. This was going to be generational disaster, the kind of event that divided time into before and after. They dug out properly on the morning of day 4. The wind had finally stopped, leaving silence that felt unnatural after 70 hours of constant howling. The temperature was -20, cold enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes, but survivable with proper clothing and caution. Hartwell and Brennan emerged into landscape that bore no resemblance to the Wyoming they'd known. Drifts had reached 15 feet against north-facing structures. The prairie looked like frozen ocean waves of white locked in mid-motion. The first body they found was a horse from Brennan's herd, one of the 3 they had been forced to leave behind. It had died against the collapsed barn, frozen in position that suggested it had been trying to dig into the wreckage for shelter. The second was 50 yards away, having attempted to walk towards safety, but succumbing to cold and wind before reaching any protection. The third they never found, presumably buried under snow in location they couldn't identify. Brennan stood over the first body without speaking. These animals had depended on him, had trusted that his barn would keep them safe. The barn's failure was his failure, regardless of whether he could have predicted conditions that exceeded engineering specifications. Hartwell understood the guilt because he'd felt it in the cavalry watching soldiers die, because orders from officers who weren't present proved inadequate for situations those officers hadn't experienced. You saved 4, that matters. 7 minus 3 is 4. 4 divided by 12 is 33% survival. That's catastrophic loss. 4 divided by 0 is infinite. Without my stable, you'd have lost all 12. The mathematics of perspective. Brennan nodded slowly, accepting the logic without fully believing it yet. Guilt wasn't rational, didn't respond to statistical arguments. But facts were facts. He'd lost horses, but he'd also saved horses, and the saving had only been possible because Hartwell had built something that everyone had mocked. They walked toward Tate's property, moving slowly through snow that reached their thighs in places. The barn's collapse had been total. Walls had folded inward under snow load that exceeded 20 tons, creating a pile of broken timber that vaguely suggested the structure's original shape. Horses had died trapped underneath, suffocated, before freezing, their final moments spent in darkness and crushing pressure in the knowledge that the shelter they'd trusted had become their tomb. Tate was standing in the ruins when they arrived. He'd been there since dawn, digging with hands that were bloody from working without gloves, uncovering horse after horse in sequence that mapped the catastrophe's progression. 14 animals near the eastern wall killed instantly when that section fell first. 19 in the center where the main beams had come down, their skulls crushed by timber that weighed hundreds of pounds. The rest scattered around the perimeter, some killed by collapse, others surviving the initial failure, only to die from cold in the hours that followed, while Tate had been unable to reach them through the storm. He looked at Hartwell without recognition. At first, his face slack with shock that had pushed past normal emotional response into blank registration of facts. When awareness finally returned, his expression didn't change to anger or shame or any emotion Hartwell expected. Instead, it collapsed into something worse, a grief so profound it erased everything else. 52. All of them. Every single one. Oh, I'm sorry. The words were inadequate but necessary. Tate had been wrong, but that didn't make the loss less devastating. These horses hadn't died because Tate was bad or cruel or negligent. They died because he'd trusted construction and money and conventional wisdom, and those things had proved insufficient against conditions no one could have reasonably predicted. The tragedy wasn't moral failure, just catastrophic bad luck, combined with circumstances that exceeded normal parameters. Your horses lived. It wasn't accusation, just statement of facts spoken with tone that carried no emotion at all. Tate's capacity for feeling had been exhausted by 72 hours of hell, followed by morning discovery that his worst fears were understated rather than exaggerated. He'd lost everything that mattered professionally and psychologically. The horses were gone. The barn was destroyed. His reputation as the territory's authority on proper ranching was in ruins as total as the structure around them. All six, plus four of Thomas's, plus a foal born during the storm. 11 horses in your hole, 11 out of 64 on 3 ranches. That's 17% survival. The mathematics again, different perspective, but same relentless logic. Numbers didn't care about intention or preparation. They just counted what lived and what died, rendering judgment that no amount of explanation could soften. Tate turned back to his digging, uncovering another horse, this one's legs broken from falling timber. Hartwell and Brennan left him to his grim accounting, knowing there was nothing they could offer that would help. They spent the next week checking on neighbors. Samuel Pritchard had lost 14 of 16 horses. His roof collapsed partial enough that 2 animals near the door had escaped. David Morrison had lost 7 of 9 when his barn door froze shut, and the horses had panicked, injuring themselves against walls and each other in terror that killed as surely as cold. Rancher after rancher reported casualties in double digits, 64 horses dead here, 47 there, 39 on another property. The numbers accumulated into catastrophe whose full scope wouldn't be known until spring, when snow melted enough to reveal bodies currently hidden under drifts. The Stockmen's Association meeting on January 20th drew every surviving rancher in the territory. The gathering had been scheduled months earlier to discuss spring branding procedures. Instead, it became impromptu memorial service and crisis planning session, men gathering to count their dead and calculate whether they had enough remaining capital to continue operating. The mood was funeral without the comfort of ritual grief, mixed with financial panic that came from losing inventory worth thousands of dollars in single night. William Tate stood to speak his appearance, shocking those who'd seen him before the storm. He'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks, his face drawn and his eyes carrying distance that suggested he was watching from somewhere outside his own body. The speech he gave was nothing like his usual performance, no bombast or certainty or judgment, just facts delivered in tone that was almost clinical. I lost 52 horses when my barn collapsed on the first night. I had spent $22,000 on that structure, hired the best architect available, used Oregon lumber, because I wanted the finest materials. It failed completely. Every horse died. Meanwhile, Hartwell's underground stable, which I called foolish and mocked publicly, saved every animal inside. 6 of his horses survived. 4 of Brennan's survived after taking shelter there. A foal was born underground and lived. My arrogance killed 52 horses that deserved better judgment from the man responsible for them. The silence that followed was total. Nobody had expected public confession of error from Tate, whose identity was built on being right. His self-destruction was almost painful to witness, not because anyone enjoyed his suffering, but because it forced acknowledgement that they'd all been wrong. Every rancher who'd laughed at Hartwell's home had participated in culture of certainty that punished unconventional thinking. Tate was just the most visible casualty of collective failure to consider that traditional methods might not be optimal. Hartwell stood because someone needed to interrupt Tate's self-flagellation before it became complete psychological collapse. I didn't build the stable to prove anyone wrong. I built it because I saw horses die that shouldn't have died, and I wanted to prevent that if I could. What happened wasn't about being smarter than anyone else. It was about watching something work once and wondering if it could work again. The Cheyenne didn't invent underground shelter, they just recognized what the land was already showing them. I did the same thing, but you were right. I was prepared for one specific condition. If lightning had struck my stable, or a wolf pack had gotten inside, or any of a dozen other disasters had occurred, my horses would have died and yours would have lived. This wasn't wisdom triumphing over ignorance. This was one approach working better than another under these particular circumstances. Next time the circumstances will be different and different approaches will work better. The words gave Tate something to hold on to beyond pure self-condemnation. Luck had played role not just in Hartwell's success but in everyone's failure. The storm had been unprecedented. The temperature drop had exceeded anything in living memory. The sustained wind had pushed past extreme into unimaginable. Yes, the underground stable had worked better, but that didn't mean Tate had committed sin by building conventionally. He'd just been unlucky in ways that no one could have predicted. Thomas Brennan spoke next, his voice carrying authority that came from having survived catastrophe and learned from it. I'm building an underground stable this spring. Hartwell has agreed to help with the design. Any rancher who wants to learn is welcome to observe. This storm taught us that traditional methods aren't sufficient for Wyoming winters. We either adapt or we keep losing horses. I'm choosing to adapt. The motion passed without dissent. The association would recommend underground, stable construction to all members, provide technical consultation to those who wanted it, and document the results for future ranchers who would face similar conditions. The reversal of sentiment was total culture of mockery replaced by eagerness to learn. Hartwell had become expert through the simple expedient of being right when everyone else was catastrophically wrong. He left the meeting early uncomfortable with attention that felt unearned. The stable had worked, but that didn't make him hero. It made him fortunate or prepared or both. The line between those things was too thin to build identity around. He'd done what seemed logical based on what he'd observed. That others hadn't seen the same logic didn't make them stupid, just different in their observations and conclusions. February brought slow thaw, punctuated by cold snaps that felt mild compared to January's fury. Hartwell helped Brennan design his underground stable, explaining principles without claiming ownership of ideas that had been developed by countless people across generations. The techniques weren't new, just new to Wyoming ranching, and that distinction mattered. He was an inventor, just adapter, taking knowledge from one context and applying it to another. Samuel Pritchard began his own excavation in late February. David Morrison followed in early March. By April 8, ranchers were actively digging, creating underground facilities that ranged from exact copies of Hartwell's design to variations that adapted the core principles to different terrain and herd sizes. The transformation was happening faster than anyone had predicted. Desperation and recent memory of catastrophic loss creating motivation that normal circumstances never would have generated. Tate visited Hartwell's property in late March, arriving unannounced at dawn. He'd been working on his own excavation for 6 weeks, learning through physical labor what humility actually meant. His hands were calloused now, his expensive clothes replaced by practical work garments. The change wasn't just appearance, but fundamental reordering of priorities. Wealth didn't protect against nature. Certainty didn't prevent disaster. Only willingness to learn and adapt and acknowledge previous error created possibility for different outcomes. I want to show you something. They rode to Tate's property together, picking way through mud and melting snow. The barn ruins had been cleared away, timber salvaged where possible, and burned where it was too damaged to repurpose. In place of the above-ground structure, Tate had excavated hole that made Hartwell's stable look modest. 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, 12 feet deep, lined with stone and timber in patterns that showed careful thought about load distribution and ventilation. The design was ambitious, bordering on excessive, but thorough in ways that demonstrated Tate had learned his lesson about not assuming superior resources guaranteed superior results. Capacity for 40 horses. I'll never have that many again, but I want room to help neighbors if another storm comes. Proper ventilation shafts on both ends for redundancy. Stone floor with drainage channels. Hay storage built into the design instead of requiring separate structure. I've spent 3 months thinking about everything that could go wrong and trying to prevent it. Hartwell walked the space, noting details that went beyond simple copying. Tate had genuinely learned, taking basic principles and extending them in directions that showed understanding rather than memorization. The stable would work probably better than Hartwell's original because Tate had capital to invest in refinements that budget had prevented in the first version. This is good work, better than mine in some ways. The compliment meant something to Tate, validation from someone whose judgment he'd learned to trust. His face showed relief that came from deeper place than simple praise. He'd needed to prove to himself more than anyone that failure hadn't destroyed his capacity to do good work. The horses had died, but he could still build, could still contribute, could still participate in community, even after being monumentally wrong about fundamental assumptions. They stood at the stable entrance, together looking out across prairie that was starting to green with spring growth. The winter had changed everything, not just physically, but psychologically. The territory's ranchers were building different now, thinking different, acknowledging that conventional wisdom could be conventionally wrong. Hartwell had catalyzed that change but didn't own it. The transformation belonged to everyone who chose to learn from disaster instead of simply mourning it. Hope the foal born underground during the storm stood in Hartwell's pasture, watching them. She'd survived against odds that said premature births and crisis conditions has resulted in dead offspring. Her existence proved something beyond stable design, some principle about resilience and adaptation that applied to more than architecture. Life found ways to continue even in circumstances that should have been fatal. The question was whether humans were smart enough to learn from life's example. The spring count came in mid-April when snow had melted enough to reveal what winter had hidden. The Territorial Livestock Association sent surveyors to document losses, creating official record that would inform insurance claims and future policy decisions. The numbers were worse than anyone had estimated during those first weeks of January aftermath. 2,247 horses dead across Wyoming territory. Some ranches had lost everything. Others had survived with partial herds that weren't viable for breeding or work programs. The economic damage extended beyond simple replacement cost into structural collapse of operations that depended on horse numbers to function. Hartwell's stable became pilgrimage site as the survey results circulated. Ranchers traveled from counties he'd never visited, asking questions about excavation depth and ventilation design and thermal mass calculations. He answered each inquiry with patience that surprised him, discovering that teaching came naturally when students were motivated by recent trauma rather than abstract curiosity. These men had watched animals die. They weren't asking theoretical questions. They were trying to prevent repeating January's horror. A rancher named Michael Carson arrived from Montana in late April, having ridden 300 miles to see the underground stable that had achieved perfect survival rate during the worst storm in recorded history. He brought detailed notes about his own losses, 43 horses dead from combination of barn collapse and exposure, and questions that showed he'd been thinking deeply about what had gone wrong. I read the association report. Your stable maintained 38 degrees while outside temperature hit negative 37. That's 75-degree differential. How is that possible without active heating? Hartwell led him underground, letting the space answer for itself. Earth temperature at this depth stays around 50 degrees year-round. Stone walls provide thermal mass that absorbs and radiates heat, slowly preventing rapid temperature swings. 6 horses generate heat equivalent to small stove through their metabolic processes. The combination creates stable environment that doesn't depend on burning fuel or maintaining mechanical systems. Carson walked the perimeter, touching stone walls, examining ceiling beams, calculating load distributions with engineer's eye. I studied architecture before ranching. This is sophisticated design disguised as simple construction. The ventilation shaft placement creates natural convection cycle. The entrance ramp angle prevents wind penetration. Even the hay storage location contributes to temperature stability. This wasn't luck. This was extremely careful planning. I had 15 years to think about it. That helps. The comment revealed what Hartwell rarely discussed, that the stable's design had been incubating since that October night in 1878 when cavalry horses froze while Cheyenne ponies survived. 15 years of observation and calculation and mental iteration, testing ideas against remembered conditions and imagined scenarios. The physical construction had taken 7 months, but the intellectual construction had taken a decade and a half. Carson understood this, immediately recognized that apparent simplicity masked layers of thought that casual observers missed. You're going to see copies of this across every territory where winter kills livestock. You've changed how people think about shelter. I just showed what was already there. The Cheyenne knew this generations ago. I'm not inventing anything. But you translated indigenous knowledge into form that ranchers will accept and adopt. That's not small contribution. That's transformation of industry practice. Hartwell felt uncomfortable with the framing. He hadn't set out to transform anything just to keep his own horses alive. That others were learning from his success felt accidental byproduct of being right about one specific thing at one specific time. The praise suggested intentionality. He didn't possess strategic vision that made him seem like architect of change rather than man who'd gotten lucky with an idea that happened to work. Carson left with measurements and sketches promising to build Montana's first underground stable by autumn. His departure was followed by others, creating steady stream of visitors through May and June. Hartwell's property became informal school where practical education happened through demonstration rather than lecture. He charged nothing for consultations, viewing knowledge sharing as obligation rather than opportunity. These men had lost animals. Helping them prevent future losses wasn't commodity to monetize, but basic human decency. The Stockmen's Association meeting in June focused entirely on winter preparation for the coming season. The calendar said summer, but everyone was already thinking about next January, about whether this year's storm had been anomaly or preview of new normal. Climate patterns seemed to be shifting. Old-timers reported winters getting harsher and more unpredictable than in their youth. Whether this was accurate observation or selective memory didn't matter. The perception alone was enough to drive preparation that previous generations would have considered excessive. William Tate stood to present findings from his research into historical weather patterns. He'd spent 3 months in Cheyenne archives studying records that documented Wyoming winters going back 60 years. His findings suggested that extreme cold events occurred in roughly 20-year cycles, with the last major outbreak in 1864. That meant 1884's storm, while unprecedented in living memory, fit historical pattern that older records preserved. We're not facing new phenomenon. We're facing recurring pattern that our personal experience didn't prepare us to recognize. The ranchers who settled here after 64 thought they understood Wyoming winters because they'd survived several moderate ones. Then 84 came and killed their horses because they'd prepared for average conditions instead of extreme outliers. The implication was clear. 1884 wouldn't be the last extreme winter. Another would come in 20 years or 10 or next season. Building for average conditions guaranteed eventual catastrophic failure. Only building for worst-case scenarios provided reasonable assurance of consistent survival. The underground stables weren't optional improvements, but necessary infrastructure for anyone who wanted to ranch in Wyoming long-term. Thomas Brennan completed his excavation in July. His design incorporated lessons from both Hartwell's original and Tate's expanded version, creating hybrid that balanced cost against capacity. The stable could hold 15 horses, comfortably room enough for his core herd, plus neighbors' animals in emergency. He'd added innovations that Hartwell hadn't considered, including water collection system that captured spring melt for summer use, and storage alcoves built into the walls for equipment protection. The opening was informal celebration, ranchers gathering to see proof that underground construction could scale beyond Hartwell's single example. Brennan led his horses down the ramp one at a time, each animal hesitating briefly before accepting the descent into earth. The process was identical to what Hartwell had experienced 9 months earlier. Horses trusting humans to lead them into strange spaces that instincts said were wrong, but experience proved safe. This feels right in ways above-ground barns never did. The horses are calmer, more settled, like they know this place will protect them. Hartwell watched from the entrance, feeling satisfaction that had nothing to do with being proven correct. Brennan had lost horses in January. Now he'd built structure that would prevent repeating that loss. The underground stable wasn't monument to Hartwell's wisdom, but Brennan's willingness to learn from tragedy. The transformation belonged to Brennan, earned through grief and labor, an honest acknowledgement that previous methods had been insufficient. Samuel Pritchard finished his stable in August. David Morrison completed his in September. By October 31, underground facilities had been built across Wyoming, creating a network of protected spaces that would keep roughly 400 horses safe during the coming winter. The construction boom had secondary effects. Nobody anticipated creating demand for stonemasons and excavation crews and timber suppliers that stimulated territorial economy in ways normal construction wouldn't have matched. A young rancher named Robert Hayes arrived at Hartwell's property in late October with unusual request. His father had been cavalry officer during the 1870s, stationed at Fort Laramie. when Hartwell was serving his final years before resignation. Hayes had grown up hearing stories about the sergeant who defied orders and resigned rather than participate in policies he considered unjust. Now he wanted to learn from the same man who'd taught him through example that principles sometimes mattered more than career advancement. My father was Captain Edmund Hayes. You served under him during the Dull Knife Pursuit. Hartwell's memory supplied details that 20 years hadn't erased. Hayes Sr. had been decent officer, not exceptional, but competent and fair, someone who treated enlisted men like humans rather than equipment. The revelation that Hayes had told his son about Hartwell's resignation created strange continuity connection across decades between military decision and civilian consequence. Your father was a good man. I respected him even when we disagreed. He respected you too. Said you were right about the Cheyenne horses, right about wind protection, right about a lot of things the Army refused to acknowledge. When you resigned, he told me that sometimes the smartest people are the ones who know when to leave. The conversation revealed dimension Hartwell hadn't considered, that his departure from cavalry hadn't been seen as failure by everyone. Some had recognized it as principled, stand decision to prioritize conviction over comfort. Hayes Sr. had apparently been one of those and had passed that interpretation to his son as lesson about integrity that outlasted the specific circumstances that generated it. I came to learn about underground stables, but also to apologize. My father enforced policies that killed those cavalry horses. He knew better, you'd shown him better, but he followed orders because that's what officers do. I wanted you to know that he regretted it, talked about it until he died 3 years ago. Said you'd been right, and the Army's stubbornness had killed 14 horses that should have lived. The apology was gift Hartwell hadn't known he needed. For 20 years, he'd carried those deaths as personal failure, believing he should have argued harder, or demonstrated more clearly, or found some way to make officers understand. Knowing that at least one officer had recognized the truth and acknowledged it, even if only privately, provided closure that Hartwell had assumed would never come. The cavalry horses had died, but their death hadn't been meaningless if it taught lessons that prevented future deaths. Build your stable deep enough that frost can't reach. Ventilate it properly so air moves but doesn't stagnate. Calculate thermal mass so temperature stays stable regardless of external conditions. And remember that you're not building for horses you have, but for horses you might need to shelter during emergency. Always build larger than minimum requirements. Hayes took notes with precision that reminded Hartwell of military briefings, questions organized to extract maximum information with minimum repetition. The education happened over 3 days, Hartwell explaining principles, while Hayes observed actual stable operation and horse behavior. When Hayes finally left, he carried knowledge that would save Montana horses the following winter, preventing repetition of Wyoming's catastrophe in adjacent territory. The winter of 1884 to 1885 came without the apocalyptic fury of its predecessor. Temperatures dropped to 20 below, cold enough to kill unprepared animals, but manageable for those in proper shelter. The underground stables performed exactly as designed, maintaining comfortable temperatures, while above-ground barns struggled with gaps in drafts and heat loss. Mortality rates for horses in underground facilities ran at 2.3%, mostly animals that were sick or injured before winter began. Above-ground barns saw 14.7% mortality, not catastrophic, but economically significant across large herds. The comparison wasn't fair in some ways. Ranchers building underground had learned from January's disaster, had invested in better construction and more careful planning than they'd applied to above-ground facilities. The performance difference reflected not just architectural advantages, but improved practice born from recent trauma. Still, the numbers were stark enough to convince remaining skeptics that underground construction offered measurable benefits beyond psychological comfort. Hartwell spent that winter monitoring his stable with satisfaction that came from watching something work repeatedly rather than once. The 6 original horses had been joined by 4 from Brennan's herd, creating community that had bonded across months of proximity. Hope, now 9 months old, had grown into sturdy yearling that showed no ill effects from premature birth. Her existence was daily reminder that proper environment could overcome disadvantages that would have been fatal in harsher conditions. William Tate visited in February his massive stable housing 37 horses that represented his rebuilt breeding program. He'd purchased replacement stock, carefully focusing on hardiness rather than pedigree, prioritizing survival traits over aesthetic qualities that rich ranchers traditionally valued. The transformation from conventional to practical was complete. Tate's entire operation now organized around principles he'd once mocked. I've been thinking about something you said last year, that you weren't smarter than anyone else, just prepared for one specific condition. I think that's false humility. You were smarter, not because you knew more facts, but because you questioned assumptions everyone else accepted. That's different kind of intelligence, maybe more valuable than conventional expertise. Hartwell considered the distinction. I questioned because I'd seen those horses die. Experience made me doubt, not intelligence. Anyone who'd witnessed the same thing would have questioned the same assumptions. But most people who witness contradiction between expectation and reality don't revise their expectations. They explain away the reality. You did opposite. That's cognitive flexibility that can't be taught, only modeled and hoped others will imitate. The conversation revealed how much Tate had changed beyond simply building different stable. He was thinking differently about knowledge and certainty and the relationship between expertise and error. The man who'd been territory's authority on proper ranching had become student of his own fallibility, examining how confidence had prevented learning and how loss had created space for growth that success never would have allowed. Spring of 1885 brought survey results that confirmed what winter observation had suggested. Horse mortality in underground facilities was drastically lower than conventional barns across every measured category. The data was comprehensive enough that territorial government began offering tax incentives for underground construction, recognizing that reducing livestock losses benefited everyone through economic stability and improved food security. What had started as one man's eccentric project had become official policy in less than 2 years. Thomas Brennan organized summer construction workshops teaching excavation and stoneworking to ranchers who wanted to build their own facilities but lacked technical skills. Hartwell participated as consultant but refused leadership role, preferring to demonstrate techniques rather than direct others. The collaborative approach worked better than hierarchical instruction, creating community of practice where knowledge flowed multiple directions rather than top-down from expert to students. By autumn of 1885, 89 underground stables existed across Wyoming territory, representing 57% of ranches with horse operations. The adoption rate was remarkable for agricultural innovation, driven by combination of demonstrated success and recent memory of catastrophic failure. Ranchers who might have resisted change for decades had converted within 18 months, fear proving more motivating than efficiency or profit. The economic impacts extended beyond simple survival rates. Ranchers with underground stables spent 60% less on winter feed because horses in stable temperatures required fewer calories to maintain body heat. Veterinary costs dropped similarly as horses protected from cold stress suffered fewer respiratory infections and colic episodes. The initial investment in excavation repaid itself within 3 years through reduced operating costs, making underground construction financially rational even without considering reduced mortality. A professor from the newly established University of Wyoming visited in spring of 1886 to document the underground stable phenomenon for academic journal focused on agricultural innovation. Professor Martin Whitestone had studied farming and ranching practices across Western territories, looking for patterns of adaptation that succeeded or failed in harsh environments. Wyoming's rapid adoption of underground horse housing represented exactly the kind of innovation that interested him, practical knowledge emerging from crisis rather than theoretical study. This is a remarkable case study in how communities learn from disaster. Most agricultural innovation diffuses slowly, taking decades to achieve 50% adoption. You've achieved that in 2 years. The speed suggests that the pain of January 1884 created receptivity to change that normal conditions never generate. Hartwell had never thought about adoption rates or diffusion patterns, concerns that seemed academic compared to practical matter of keeping horses alive. But Whitestone's framing revealed larger pattern that the underground stables represented something beyond individual ranchers making individual decisions. This was collective transformation, community-wide revision of practice that happened because shared experience had created shared understanding that old methods were insufficient. What happens when people who didn't lose horses in January '84 move here? Will they adopt underground construction or revert to conventional barns because they don't have personal experience with catastrophic failure? The question identified risk Hartwell hadn't considered. The current generation of Wyoming ranchers were building underground because they'd watched horses die or heard firsthand accounts from neighbors who'd lost everything. Future ranchers arriving after memory of '84 had faded might not feel same urgency. They might see underground stables as expensive overcorrection to problem that no longer seemed threatening. The innovation could die with the generation that remembered why it mattered. That's why documentation matters. You're creating record that will survive individual memory. When someone new arrives and asks why everyone builds underground, they can read reports that explain the reasoning without having to experience the disaster themselves. Whitestone spent 3 weeks interviewing ranchers and measuring stable performance and documenting construction techniques. His resulting paper appeared in the Journal of Western Agricultural Practice in autumn 1886, disseminating Wyoming's lessons to ranching communities across Western territories. The academic publication gave underground stables credibility that word of mouth couldn't match, transforming local practice into documented innovation that others could evaluate and adapt. The paper brought visitors from Colorado, Montana, and the Dakotas. Each territory had experienced its own version of harsh winter, maybe not as severe as Wyoming's '84, but bad enough to motivate seeking better solutions. Hartwell's property became educational center by accident, hosting ranchers who arrived expecting expert instruction but found collaborative learning instead. He'd share what worked, visitors would suggest modifications based on their different conditions, and everyone would leave with improved understanding that no single person could have generated alone. A rancher from northern Colorado named Patricia Kimball arrived in summer of 1887 with questions about adapting underground construction to terrain that was hillier than Wyoming prairie. She'd lost 31 horses to avalanche the previous winter, entire herd buried under snow that had slid off mountain into valley where her barn stood. Underground construction wouldn't prevent avalanche, but might allow building in locations where surface structures were vulnerable to snow loading. Could you excavate into mountainside instead of hill? Create stable that's essentially tunnel rather than buried chamber. Hartwell walked the concept through testing structural implications against his understanding of earth mechanics. The principle would be similar, but the execution would require different approach to support and drainage. Tunnel construction meant dealing with greater earth pressure on walls, requiring heavier reinforcement than his prairie design used. But it was possible, maybe even preferable, in terrain where finding suitable hills was difficult. Build into slope that faces away from avalanche paths. Ensure drainage exits downhill from stable rather than pooling inside. Reinforce ceiling more heavily because you'll have mountain weight above you instead of hill. Ventilation becomes critical because you can't rely on natural convection the same way. Kimball took notes and measurements, adapting principles to her specific conditions. Her resulting stable, completed autumn 1887, became model for mountain ranching that spread through Colorado and eventually into Oregon and Washington territories. The innovation wasn't Hartwell's anymore, if it ever had been. It belonged to everyone who took core concepts and modified them to match their circumstances, creating family of related designs that shared DNA but expressed it differently. The winter of 1887 brought severe cold that tested the expanded network of underground facilities. Temperatures dropped to 35 below in late December, sustained for 9 days, in conditions that would have killed hundreds of horses 5 years earlier. Instead, mortality remained negligible. The stables performed as designed, maintaining temperatures that kept horses comfortable and healthy, despite exterior conditions that made survival impossible for exposed animals. William Tate hosted celebration at his property in March 1888, marking 4 years since the disaster that had killed his herd and destroyed his certainty. 37 horses now lived in his underground stable, proof that recovery was possible even after catastrophic loss. The gathering drew ranchers from across the territory, creating informal reunion of people who'd shared trauma and emerged changed by it. 4 years ago, I stood in ruins of my barn and counted 52 dead horses. I'd spent more money than most ranchers earn, in lifetime trusted the best architects and finest materials, and it all failed completely. I blamed Hartwell, initially resented that his cheap hole worked while my expensive barn collapsed. That resentment was easier than admitting I'd been wrong about fundamental assumptions I'd never questioned. The crowd listened in silence that felt almost sacred, witnessing confession that went beyond simple apology into examination of how pride distorted judgment. Tate had changed in ways that went deeper than construction methods, developing humility that came from facing complete failure and choosing to learn from it rather than retreating into defensive justification. Hartwell taught me that being right once doesn't make you right forever. That conventional wisdom can be conventionally wrong. That listening to people who think differently isn't weakness, but survival strategy. 4 years later, every horse in my stable is alive because I was willing to admit I didn't know everything. That's worth more than the money I lost, more than the reputation I had to rebuild. That's transformation that only comes from breaking completely and choosing to become something better. Hartwell stood at the back of the gathering, uncomfortable with attention, but recognizing importance of the moment. Tate wasn't just crediting underground construction, he was acknowledging that learning required vulnerability, that success often prevented. The horses had died, but their deaths had purchased knowledge that prevented repeating the tragedy. That knowledge had value that extended beyond simple survival rates into fundamental revision of how communities approached innovation and change. The Stockmen's Association commissioned formal study in 1890, documenting 6 years of underground, stable performance across 156 ranches. The data was comprehensive, tracking mortality rates, feed costs, veterinary expenses, and construction investments. The findings confirmed what practical experience had already demonstrated. Underground facilities reduced winter mortality from 14.7% to 2.3%, decreased feed costs by 60%, and cut veterinary expenses by similar margins. The economic benefits were undeniable, making underground construction rational choice, even for ranchers who hadn't experienced January '84 personally. The study's publication created secondary wave of adoption. Ranchers who'd resisted initial wave because they hadn't lost horses themselves now converted based on economic analysis rather than fear. By 1895, underground stables had become standard practice across Wyoming, Montana, northern Colorado, and parts of the Dakotas. The innovation had spread beyond its origin point, becoming established practice that new ranchers adopted without questioning whether alternatives might work better. Hartwell watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Success meant his horses and hundreds like them would survive winters that previously would have killed them. But success also meant underground stables were becoming new orthodoxy, potentially as rigid as the conventional wisdom they'd replaced. He worried that future generations would build underground because everyone built underground, losing sight of the observational thinking that had generated the practice originally. Innovation could calcify into tradition if people forgot to keep questioning and adapting. Thomas Brennan understood these concerns, having thought about similar patterns during his own transition from conventional to underground construction. The challenge isn't preventing people from copying what works. The challenge is preserving the questioning attitude that let us recognize what worked in the first place. We need to teach people to observe and adapt, not just to build underground, because that's what we do here. The conversation happened in spring of 1896 during an informal gathering at Hartwell's property. A dozen ranchers had come to see Hope, now 12 years old, and mother to 3 foals of her own. Her survival and thriving represented complete validation of underground construction's benefits, living proof that the approach worked across multiple generations. But Hartwell and Brennan were already thinking beyond current success to future challenges that would require different innovations. Next crisis won't be winter cold. Might be summer drought or disease outbreak or market collapse. Whatever it is, we'll need to observe and adapt, same way we did with winter shelter. The underground stables aren't an end of learning, and they're an example of how learning happens. The insight captured something essential about innovation that most people missed. Success wasn't about finding one right answer that worked forever. Success was about developing capacity to recognize when current answers were failing and willingness to search for better ones. The underground stables were important not because they solved winter mortality, but because they demonstrated that observation and adaptation could solve problems that conventional wisdom declared unsolvable. Hartwell's original stable remained in operation through 1897, 14 years after initial construction. The horses had changed multiple times as older animals died and were replaced, but the space itself remained largely unaltered. The stone walls showed wear from thousands of horse movements. The ceiling beams had darkened with age, but the fundamental structure was sound. Hartwell had built better than he knew, creating facility that would outlast his own tenure as rancher. He was 67 now, feeling age in ways he hadn't acknowledged before. The physical labor of ranching had become harder, his body accumulating injuries and wear that didn't heal as readily as they had in cavalry days. He'd been thinking about succession, about what would happen to his property, and knowledge when he could no longer maintain either. He had no children, no direct heirs to inherit land or lessons. The stable would pass to whoever bought the property, becoming their responsibility to maintain or abandon as they saw fit. Thomas Brennan approached him in autumn of 1898 with proposal that solved the succession question in an unexpected way. Let me buy half your land. I'll manage operations while you transition to advisory role. Your stable becomes teaching facility that demonstrates principles for new ranchers. Your knowledge gets preserved through ongoing practice instead of depending on you personally. The offer was generous beyond simple property transaction, acknowledging that Hartwell's value wasn't just his land, but his understanding of how to use it effectively. Brennan wanted to preserve both, ensuring that the physical infrastructure and intellectual framework survived beyond Hartwell's active participation. The arrangement would transform individual achievement into institutional knowledge-making lessons available to future generations who would never meet the man who generated them. Hartwell accepted after thinking it through for a week. The agreement made sense practically and philosophically, allowing him to step back while ensuring his work continued. The stable would keep operating, keep sheltering his horses, keep demonstrating that observation and adaptation could solve problems. Conventional wisdom declared impossible. That continuity mattered more than personal ownership or credit. The transfer happened in spring 1899. Hartwell retained small cabin and pasture sufficient for his remaining horses, while Brennan assumed management of the main property. The underground stable became official demonstration site, hosting ranchers from territories as distant as Nevada and Idaho who wanted to learn firsthand about construction and operation. The teaching happened naturally through observation rather than formal instruction, visitors spending days or weeks watching daily routines and asking questions that arose from seeing principles in practice. William Tate died in 1900, his passing marking end of an era in Wyoming ranching. He'd rebuilt his operation completely after '84, creating a breeding program that prioritized hardiness over pedigree and became model for practical horse selection. His funeral drew hundreds, testament to respect he'd earned through public acknowledgement of error and commitment to learning from it. Hartwell attended, honoring man who transformed from antagonist to ally through honest examination of his own failures. At the graveside, Tate's son spoke about lessons his father had taught through example rather than lecture. He said the worst thing that happened to our family was losing those 52 horses. But the best thing was watching him admit he'd been wrong and change everything based on that admission. He taught me that intelligence isn't about being right the first time, it's about recognizing when you're wrong and having courage to do something different. The words applied beyond Tate personally capturing something about community-wide transformation that January '84 had catalyzed. Wyoming's ranchers had been wrong about winter shelter, wrong in ways that killed thousands of horses. But they'd recognized their error and changed their practices, creating new normal that prevented repeating the disaster. That collective adaptation was rare enough to deserve celebration, evidence that communities could learn from trauma instead of simply surviving it. Hartwell lived to 72, passing quietly in his sleep during October 1911. His obituary in the Cheyenne newspaper noted his military service and ranching success, but made no mention of the stable that had started it all. The omission seemed appropriate to those who knew the full story. Hartwell had never sought recognition for underground construction, viewing it as practical response to observed problem, rather than achievement deserving special credit. The Stockmen's Association erected monument at his grave in 1915, 4 years after his death. The stone marker acknowledged what the obituary had missed, identifying him as man who'd transformed Wyoming ranching through willingness to question conventional wisdom and test alternative approaches. The inscription was simple: James Hartwell, who taught us to dig down instead of build up and saved 1,000 horses by saving 6. Thomas Brennan maintained the original stable until 1923, then passed it to a younger generation who'd never known winters without underground shelter. The facility operated until 1952, when mechanization made horse ranching obsolete and the new owner filled it in. But the principle survived its physical form. Earth-sheltered construction for livestock spread across territories where winter killed exposed animals. The specific application changed. Tractors replaced horses, modern materials replaced stone and timber. But the underlying insight remained. Earth protects what air cannot, and the best shelter works with nature rather than against it. Agricultural historians studying innovation diffusion in the late 20th century identified Wyoming's underground stables as a remarkable case of rapid community-wide adaptation to environmental crisis. The speed of adoption, the thoroughness of transformation, and the durability of changed practice all suggested that the right combination of demonstrated success and recent trauma could overcome resistance to change that normally slowed agricultural innovation. The lessons extended beyond ranching into broader questions about how communities learn and adapt under pressure. The Cheyenne who dug into hillsides during 1878 blizzard had known something the cavalry didn't, something that James Hartwell recognized and translated into form his community could accept. That translation was neither simple nor automatic, requiring observation and thought and construction that tested his commitment through months of mockery and physical labor. His success hadn't been guaranteed, could easily have failed and confirmed his critics' judgment. But it worked, and working created space for others to try similar approaches, which worked for them, creating cascade of adoption that transformed regional practice. The story became myth, with retelling details simplified and contradictions smoothed until what remained was simple narrative of lone genius vindicated by disaster. But the truth was messier and more interesting, involving luck and observation and willingness to be wrong, and communities slowly learning to value adaptation over tradition. Hartwell hadn't been lone genius. He'd been capable observer who questioned assumptions and tested alternatives and got lucky that his approach worked when others failed catastrophically. The horses knew none of this. They simply lived or died based on whether humans created conditions that allowed survival. The underground stables kept them alive through winters that would have killed them in conventional barns. That was the only truth that mattered to them, the only measure of success that had consequences beyond human pride or reputation. Every horse that walked out of underground shelter into spring sun was proof that observation and adaptation could solve problems tradition declared unsolvable. The empty hillside where Hartwell's stable once stood showed no trace of the excavation that had sparked transformation. Grass grew thick over filled-in chambers, giving no hint that beneath the surface was space where innovation had taken physical form. But the absence of markers didn't erase what had happened there, didn't diminish the cascade of change that had begun with one man digging a hole that everyone said was foolish. Sometimes the foolish thing is the only wise thing if you're willing to do it anyway.